The restaurant went silent when the manager reached for her arm. Forks paused in midair. Conversations faded into an awkward hush. And right there, in the middle of a five-star dining room where he clearly didn't belong, a single dad stood up and did the unthinkable. He didn't shout. He didn't get angry. His voice was calm and steady, just 4 words. "She's with me." And across the table, the billionaire heiress froze like she'd been struck by lightning. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you are tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. David Garrettson was a 35-year-old widower. His life was very hard. He worked at a warehouse and lived in a tiny apartment. He had a 7-year-old son named Jake. David was a good man, but he was always worried about money. He wore an old suit that he had owned for 5 years. He felt very out of place in fancy buildings. But tonight was different. It was Jake's 7th birthday. David had saved money for months to take Jake to the Gilded Rose, the most expensive restaurant in the city. He wanted his son to feel like a prince for one night. As they sat at their small table, David counted his cash under the table. He was nervous. He knew he could barely afford this meal. Sitting 3 tables away was Deborah Gomez. Deborah was a billionaire heiress. Her family owned the biggest buildings in the city. She was wearing a red dress that cost more than David's car. But Deborah was not having a good time. She was being harassed by a man named Julian Thorne. Julian was a rich and mean socialite. He was Deborah's ex-boyfriend, and he was a bully. He was angry because Deborah had ended their relationship. He sat at her table and started shouting. He called her names and told her she was nothing without him. He grabbed her arm and tried to pull her out of her chair. He was trying to rob her of her dignity and her safety. The restaurant manager saw what was happening, but the manager was a coward. He knew Julian Thorne was a powerful man who spent a lot of money at the restaurant. Instead of helping Deborah, the manager tried to make her leave so there wouldn't be a scene. He told Deborah she was causing trouble and asked her to go outside with Julian. Deborah felt terrified. She looked around the room for help, but the other rich people looked away. They didn't want to get involved with a bully like Julian. She felt like she was drowning in a room full of people. David watched all of this from his table. He saw the fear in Deborah's eyes. He saw the way Julian was squeezing her arm. David knew that if he stayed quiet, he would be safe. But he also knew that he had to be a good example for Jake. He wanted Jake to know that being a man means protecting people who are in trouble. David stood up slowly. He walked over to the table. He didn't look like a billionaire, and he didn't look like a fighter. He looked like a tired father in a cheap suit. He ignored Julian's angry looks. He looked at the manager and the bully. He placed a hand on the back of Deborah's chair. His voice was not loud, but it was very strong. "She's with me," David said. Julian laughed. "With you? Look at your suit, pal. You're a nobody." But David didn't move. He stood like a rock. The lady said no. "Now leave our table." Deborah Gomez froze. She had never been protected by someone who had nothing to gain. Usually, people helped her because they wanted her money or a job. But this man didn't even know her name. He was risking everything just to be kind. In that moment, Deborah didn't see a man in a cheap suit. She saw the only real hero she had ever met. The power in the restaurant shifted instantly. The billionaire heiress was no longer alone, and the bully realized he had finally met someone he couldn't intimidate. The manager of the Gilded Rose stood paralyzed. He was used to rich people shouting at each other, but he was not used to a man in a worn-out suit standing his ground with such quiet power. David didn't move his hand from the back of Deborah's chair. He looked directly at Julian Thorne, the man who thought his bank account made him a king. "I think you heard me," David said, his voice even lower and calmer than before. "The lady is with us now. You are making my son uncomfortable. It is time for you to go." Julian's face turned a deep, angry red. He looked at the other diners, expecting them to join him in mocking this nobody. But something strange was happening. The other guests were no longer looking at their plates. They were looking at David. There was a sense of respect growing in the room. A single dad, who clearly had very little, was doing what none of the millionaires in the room had the courage to do. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Julian hissed, leaning forward. "I could have you fired by tomorrow morning. I could make sure you never work in this city again." David didn't blink. He had spent years fearing the loss of his job, fearing the bills, and fearing the future. But looking at Julian, he realized that a man who uses threats is actually the weakest person in the room. "You might be able to take my job," David replied simply, "but you can't take my dignity. And right now, you're losing yours in front of everyone." Deborah Gomez felt a shiver go down her spine. She had spent her whole life surrounded by men like Julian, men who used their power like a hammer. She had never met a man who used his character like a shield. She looked at David's hand on her chair. It was steady and strong. For the first time in years, the billionaire heiress didn't feel like a target. She felt like a person. "Julian," Deborah said, her voice finally returning. She stood up, smoothing her red dress. "He's right. I am with them tonight. Please leave." Julian looked at Deborah, then at David, and finally at the manager. He realized he had lost. The Ice Queen had just chosen a warehouse worker over a billionaire. With a low growl, Julian grabbed his coat and stormed out of the restaurant, nearly knocking over a vase of expensive lilies on his way out. The manager tried to apologize, stuttering about misunderstandings, but Deborah ignored him. She turned to David and Jake. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," David said. He began to step back toward his own table, but Deborah stopped him. "Please," she said, gesturing to the empty chair Julian had just left. "If I'm with you tonight, maybe we should actually eat together? I think your son and I have a lot to talk about." Jake's eyes went wide. "Are you a princess?" he asked innocently. Deborah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "No, Jake, but I think your dad might be a knight." They sat together and talked for hours. David told her about the warehouse and his late wife. Deborah told him about the crushing weight of being a Gomez and how lonely it was at the top. She realized that David saw her for who she was, not for what she owned. As the night ended, David asked for the check. He was prepared to spend every cent he had, but the waiter informed him that the meal had already been taken care of. David tried to protest, but Deborah put a hand on his arm. "Consider it a thank you for the best company I've had in a decade," she said. As they walked out to the valet, David saw Julian Thorne standing by his expensive car, talking on his phone. Julian caught David's eye and mouthed the words, "You're finished." David just nodded, strapped Jake into their old, noisy car, and drove away. He didn't know that Julian was already calling the owner of David's warehouse. He didn't know that by Monday morning he would be unemployed. But as he looked at Jake sleeping in the back seat, David didn't regret a single thing. He had stood up for the truth, and that was worth more than any job. Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens to them. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button, please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never another amazing stories from me. 1 week later, a huge event was held at the city's newest community center. This was the launch of the Gomez Family Foundation, the new organization Deborah had created. Everyone from high society was there, including the media and the most powerful people in the city. Julian Thorne was also there. He was wearing an expensive tuxedo and smiling, thinking he was still the most important man in the room. He did not know that Deborah had spent the last few days investigating every lie he had ever told. Julian saw Deborah walking toward the stage to give a speech. He stepped in her way, trying to act like they were still friends. He began to brag about how he had cleared the trash out of the warehouse by getting David fired. He thought Deborah would be happy to hear it. But Deborah didn't smile. She looked at Julian with no emotion and told him that he was the most pathetic man she had ever met. She then asked her security team to move him to back of the room so she could introduce the new leader of her foundation. Deborah stood behind the microphone and looked at the crowd. She told the story of what happened at the Gilded Rose restaurant. She didn't use Julian's name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She told the crowd that true power is not found in a bank account, but in the courage to protect a stranger. She then announced that the director of her foundation would be David Garrettson. When David walked onto the stage, he looked like a completely different man. He was wearing a suit that actually fit him, and he was holding Jake's hand. The room erupted in applause. The people who had looked down on David at the restaurant were now cheering for him. Julian Thorne froze where he stood. He realized that by trying to destroy David, he had actually made David famous and successful. Even worse for Julian, Deborah revealed that her foundation would no longer do any business with the Thorne family because of their lack of integrity. In one night, Julian lost his social standing and his family's biggest business partner. He was forced to leave the building while everyone watched him fail. After the speech, David, Jake, and Deborah walked out onto the balcony to look at the city lights. David thanked Deborah for changing his life, but Deborah shook her head. She told him that he was the one who changed her life. She said that she had spent years surrounded by people who only wanted her money, and David was the first person who saw her as a human being in trouble. She realized that David's calm voice was exactly what she needed in her world of noise and greed. The story ends with a beautiful moment. Jake asked if they were ever going back to that fancy restaurant again. David looked at Deborah, and Deborah looked at David. She laughed and said that they didn't need a fancy restaurant to be happy because they had something better now. They were a team. David was no longer a struggling single dad, and Deborah was no longer a lonely heiress. They were a family built on respect and kindness. As the sun set, they realized that those 4 simple words, "she's with me," hadn't just saved a seat at the table. They had built a bridge to a brand new life. The educational lesson derived from this story is that true power and leadership are defined by character and integrity rather than social status or bank balances. While Julian Thorne used his wealth to intimidate and silence others, David Garrettson demonstrated that a calm, steady voice used to protect the vulnerable carries more authority than a bully's shout. This narrative teaches us that doing the right thing, even when it involves personal risk, creates a ripple effect of respect that can dismantle elitist structures. Ultimately, the story proves that real wealth lies in the courage to stand by others, reminding us that kindness is a universal language that can bridge the widest social divides and transform a simple act of decency into a life-changing opportunity. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. And here's what I need to know. Do you want part 2?